I've been asked about the first book I wrote, which was written in the early 1970s, and it came about because I found myself in New York, and by accident I was involved in the gay liberation movement, and I thought, I want to write a book about this. That book has been around now as part of my life for half a century, and I find it very strange when I meet people who were not born when I wrote that book and are now reading it. And there's parts of I find it very hard to read it myself. And I think the interesting question for me is how much of the idealism and the utopianism of the early gay liberation movement still exists. And if it still exists, how do we make it a political and a social reality? If we think about the evolution of what we called the gay movement in the 1970s, and gay then included women, it was very clear. It was lesbians as much as gay men. Of course, the scope of the movement has increased enormously, mainly, I think, because we have a much more complex and sophisticated embracing idea of gender and of trans issues that we really didn't understand at the time of the early gay movement. At the same time, in many Western countries, we have become very, very respectable. Now, Italy is, for me, a very interesting case because it is clearly now the least progressive country in Western Europe. And this I find very interesting because 40 years ago, when I first came to Europe, I would not have imagined that Spain would be so much ahead of Italy, but that is the current reality. So I think that what I see in my own country, Australia, what I see in much of Western Europe is a gay movement that's become respectable, that has a lot of open politicians, open business leaders, open media personalities. And at the same time, of course, globally, huge differences and a number of states, of which I suppose Russia is now the most prominent, although under Trump the United States seems to be joining in, who are attacking the rights that we thought we had won and we thought would not be contested. I think I'm being asked about how I see queer issues globally, and I think that there's a huge discrepancy between what the movement has achieved in most Western liberal democracies, although, as I say, we now look at the United States and that throws everything up in the air. I wouldn't be surprised if the US Supreme Court doesn't reverse the marriage decision in the next couple of years, for example. But I think if we think about the queer world today, it is a much more open world. It is much more embracing of diversity. And probably the biggest change is our understanding of gender. And I think that I come out of a generation that had a very clear sense that there were men and there were women, and this was biologically determined. And I think we have lived through some very interesting transitions. I know, of course, this has happened in Italy because I've met some of the leaders of trans activism in Italy, which I think means that we now use the word queer in a much broader sense. It was not a term we would have used in the 1970s except as a term of abuse. I like it. I much prefer it to the term LGBTQIA+, which I think people keep adding a letter. It doesn't really satisfy me. The cinema, I think, has always been transformative, and there's some very interesting examples in countries where any form of homosexual behaviour was illegal, where it still was possible to depict homosexuality in film. So that at one level is transformative through the art form, but of course it's also for a lot of people the possibility of sitting in a dark cinema anonymously and seeing some of your life on a screen is terribly liberating. And I think that's why queer film festivals still exist, because I think a lot of people feel the need to be with other people who are queer and share in that experience. But you know, I can remember the first time I sat in a movie theatre and I saw two men kiss. And it's a British film called Sunday Bloody Sunday, probably, mid-1970s, I think? And there was this gasp. This was in Sydney, Australia, this gasp in the movie theatre. Now, of course, you can't have a Netflix film without queer characters, you know, and the changes that that has brought about, I think for kids is so extraordinary. I have a nephew who came out to his family at the moment that Kurt in Glee came out to his father. And I think that says a lot about how, here we're talking about television, but cinema, television, the media opens up possibilities that are quite extraordinary. Look, there's always a risk when we become too respectable. And of course, when I'm asked about combining mainstream and alternative forms of any form of cultural expression, the problem is we get very easily co-opted. We get, as the French would say, récupéré. And I see that very much in my own country, in Australia, where you know, we are, let's face it, we have had made much more progress than in Italy. We had a referendum on same-sex marriage 5 years ago. It was carried with a very big vote. Marriage is legal. We have a Prime Minister who marches every time there's Mardi Gras in Sydney. Our Foreign Minister is an open Asian lesbian. I love being able to say this about her. But of course, the other side of that is that we forget the people who are queer but on the margins. We forget the people who live on the streets. We forget the kids who've been kicked out of their homes. And in countries like mine, like yours, where there are a lot of immigrant families, sometimes kids from immigrant communities have particular problems that the mainstream queer organisations seem to totally ignore. I love it. I love it. I mean, I'll be honest, I love it because it's given me an excuse to come to Palermo, which I've always wanted. But what I like about it is there's a sort of general camaraderie among people. And for me, I don't need to sit in a cinema to see these films because nowadays, let's face it, we all have access through so many ways of seeing a film. I can lie in bed and watch films on my iPad. What for me is wonderful about a festival is that it brings people together and that the films give them an opportunity to find common ground. But also, I do want to say how impressed I was by the programming, by the fact that it draws on so many countries. And it drew on countries, for example, a lot of Portuguese movies. And I didn't know anything about Portuguese queer cinema. It's something I had to come to Palermo to learn about. I also like the fact that there are lots of films that go back to the AIDS epidemic, because I'm of a generation that lived through the worst time of that epidemic. 3 of my lovers died at various stages from HIV. And so I think it's wonderful for young queers who didn't live through that period to actually see that part of our history. So all I can say is I would love to see you next year or the year after have an Australian theme, because there's some very good Australian queer movies. I'd be very happy to pass them on to you and even to suggest Australian queer directors who you might invite.